Thank you. Welcome. I'd like to call this meeting to order. I'd like to begin with our acknowledgement. We are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pay respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, Oki, and welcome. I'd also like to begin by offering our hearts go out to the families of the children and teachers who were killed or injured in the shooting at Robb Elementary School in Texas. They are in our thoughts and our prayers. So with that, looking for any additions to the agenda. To do an approval. Okay. And if I can get an approval of the agenda, Christine Light, and those in favor. And that's carried. And then moving on to the review of the feedback from the public budget presentation, and I'll turn that over to Avis.
Thank you. So the public presentation feedback form was available on the division's website, along with the budget presentation from Tuesday, May 17th until Monday, May 23rd. In that time, 3 feedback comments were received. All 3 were from parents or guardians. On the question, given the provincial funding framework that is available to the division, how would you rate this year's overall preliminary budget, 1 being poor, 5 being excellent? The responses were 1 poor, 1 good, and 1 excellent. On how would you rate the year's budget allocations of program funding, 1 being poor, 1 being excellent? The responses were 1 poor, 2 excellent, and the comments included great presentation of the budget information, and you need to hire more teachers and reduce class sizes. So I want to thank everyone who viewed the video and submitted their feedback, and if there's any questions on any of that.
Any questions for Avis? So when they had stated that it was poor, they didn't go into a great detail?
The same one was just the answer that was 1 was that you need to hire more teachers and reduce class sizes.
I think it was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the one.
Okay. I thought you'd said 2 of them had said it was poor.
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, just
there was 1 that was poor, 2 that were excellent.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, you betcha.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It's a little confusing when you.
It's all good. Okay. Any other questions for Avis? Seeing none, we'll move on to opening comments. So at this point, we have the opportunity as trustees to provide approximately up to 5 minutes for your highlights and what you'd like to bring forward in regards to the budget. So Christine, are you ready to start? Sounds good.
Thank you, Chair Purcell. I would just like to say, I would start by saying thank you to Christine Lee, Avis, the Instructional Services Committee, and Executive Council for all of the time and consideration that went into this lengthy and arduous process. And I know at the forefront of all our decisions, including the board, is the question, what is best for kids? And it's not only this question, but does this budget represent the priorities of the board, those priorities being achievement, innovation, and inclusion? And when we look at government funding, I think we can all agree that it is never enough. And when we move to our rolling moving average, the government allowed us predictability in our budget, but they didn't give us sustainability in our budget, I think, as we move forward. And in growing divisions such as ours, our funding actually decreases, and it does put us in a tenuous position. We have to choose between one essential service to another, value when they are in fact invaluable things. Things such as wellness, learning supports, staffing, early learning, programming. And it's hard decisions to make, I know, because I think when you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to another. And it's not just a thing we're saying no to, it's kids. And that is the hardest that is the hardest people group to say no to. And I'm thankful for the incredible staff that our division has, that they're dedicated to serving our students with both the incredible supports and supplies and resources that our division does have, but they're also able to be creative and innovative in the areas that we are unable to support them as fully as we would like. And in so doing, leading our students to find their successes. So not only has this budget been intentionally formed with attention of needs in mind, I believe it sets our division to a position of sustainability for a tenuous financial path ahead. I think that is wise and I think that is prudent. Areas that I would like to highlight that I have appreciated in the budget are early education. I believe in the essential years. Putting money and funding into the essential years to create strong foundations for learning, strong foundations for ensuring that needs are met and that essential supports for those students to find success can be attained and achieved and found. Universal design for learning, as well as the specialists to build capacity in areas. And I appreciate as we're moving forward in this conversation of inclusion and what does this look like in our division? How can we support our students? Just really singling out the English language learning lead teacher. I think that shows our priority of serving in this area. I appreciate the focus on wellness, as well as contingency funding for September in the amount of 4 full-time teachers. Just that, again, looking forward, the sustainability and being wise in ensuring that we have funding available for those hotspots and being able to keep our class sizes at a lower number, which has been asked for. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Who would like to go next? Christina, are you ready?
Yeah, I can go. Yeah,
you.
Thanks. So to begin, I also just want to say thank you to everybody who put time into these documents. While we certainly appreciate the division staff, I think it's important to note that this isn't a document that's created just by division staff. This is created at every level, from students saying, I want this in my classroom, to parents letting us know what's important to them, to staff bringing up their very creative ideas for how to make learning happen best for students. And for our school site administrators who tie and weave together the many things they hear all day long into a story that can be put into a budget. Some of the features that I wanted to point out for the public and for us that I really am grateful for to see in our budget. So I also really appreciate the investment in early interventions and early learning. The landscape of early learning is changing significantly in Alberta. We are seeing a real challenge come from the big investment into childcare. It is an incredible opportunity that decades and decades of education advocates have fought for to create accessible childcare. The disconnect at a provincial level between education and childcare is causing families to potentially rethink their own ability to access education, which places an unfair burden on parents of young people who need support that are offered in our excellent schools. And so I really appreciate the continued work to try to invest in early learning at our school sites, not in competition with childcare, but hand in hand, knowing that children are whole children, families are whole families, and we as a community are here to support their learning at every step. And that we are balancing an expected lower registration of kindergarten students, often because of that choice that families are now making based on childcare. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the investment in small class sizes and investing in EAs in the younger grades and a focus on literacy. We know that focusing in on those first few years at school sites makes for healthy, happy, brilliant, engaged children who read, explore, feel confident in their skills and abilities to learn. And the investments we make today, we know will pay off not only in their schooling futures and their education futures, but in every day after they graduate. For older students and in middle school and high school, we heard the call for mental health, and we are investing in over $500,000 in additional one-time funding for mental health services, which is, I'm sorry, I'm so emotional about this because it's not a small feat. This is life-changing investment for young people who are struggling through an educational experience that I can't even fathom. I think middle school was hard for everybody. It's a hard, weird time in life. And the children who are in high school now have had an even harder middle school than we can even maybe imagine. So investing in these times into mental health supports will change their lives for the better, and I appreciate that investment. I appreciate that we work to continue our investment into Indigenous educational opportunities with a focus on capacity building, getting Indigenous classrooms or Indigenous educators into classrooms, and increasing the capacity and understanding across our division that this is not something that's extra on the side of our plate, but that it's intertwined into our everyday education. I also want to note an appreciation for the supportive equity of access for newcomers and refugee students. Just a note for some context for folks. Funding for education for newcomer and refugee students can be particularly challenging at a school division level because of the way that our schools are funded based on who has enrolled by the end of September and how that impacts our funding for multiple years. This can be really challenging when it comes to newcomer students. One thing that many people don't know about refugee arrivals is that refugees pay for their own flights to Canada through a government loan that they later have to pay back. Because of this, it's almost impossible to fly during summer months. This leaves that our families need to fly at unpeak seasons, which leaves them flying in the middle of our school year and arriving to our schools at unpredictable times. They don't typically start with us at the beginning of September, like most students. And so this leaves school divisions in a tricky spot where we know that they're probably coming and we want to be ready to welcome them, and we need to balance our budget and have financial responsibility for their education. So I just appreciate the way that this division handles that. And I would encourage all of us to appreciate the balance that is in that really tricky situation. So thank you for all of those investments at all levels and for recognizing the board priorities. An area of growth that I'd love for us to consider in the future, that's something that came up for me when I was reading through, is I'd love for us as a board and as a division to start having a conversation around the use of school site fees. They have a potential to limit access or increase pressure on families to access what are often an immeasurable and impactful educational or community building opportunity. I know that all schools across the division take every effort to reduce financial barriers, and I want to emphasize that the board belief statements include that school fees should be as low as possible. I know it's a balance of trying to provide the unique and meaningful opportunities with our need for financial stability. However, for me personally, and as an advocate for many low-income families, even small fees can be a huge barrier that add up to build up walls to accessing what we know, for a grade 3 student to be some of the most memorable things that they'll remember from that time. I would trust that I do trust and deeply know that every school is dealing with this on a case-by-case basis and that students are not being left behind. However, I would love for us to see as a board what additional measures we could explore to provide universal access to these types of activities through reduction of fees. So all that being said, thank you everyone for so much work onto this budget. A budget is a document that tells us what we believe in, what we care about, and I stand behind this budget and the beliefs that it represents on our behalf. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And who would like to go next? Tyler, are you looking ready?
I'm ready and done.
Perfect. So this is the end of your comments?
How much more can I say?
Perfect. Thank you for your comments. And Andrea, are you ready?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for those eloquent comments. My goodness, those were beautiful to hear, and I support all of them. I'd like to thank Avis DeKelver and Christine Lee and their team for all the work they've put into the budget and the budget process. I'd like to thank you for the amazing pictographs that make it understandable for all of us and for the public, and the parents, and thank you to the parents and public who took time to respond to the budget. I know as a board, we wanted to reflect our 9 belief statements around the budget preparation. And for me, the belief that the budget should be developed in the best interest of all students, and the belief that education at the primary level is foundational to student success, and as such is a priority, are very important to me. Thank you to the Instructional Budget Committee. Thank you to Keith Vandermeer and Daryl Christensen and Wayne Pallett for bringing the elementary, middle, and high school priorities to the table. Class sizes, ELL support, Indigenous education, wellness support, counseling, and an increase in support staff were heard. I too would like to see more support staff and EAs added to the budget, and I hope we can increase that in the future. That's something that I will always advocate for. I appreciate the boost money that we received this year to help with the grade 2s and 3s. And I would like to thank the amazing staff of our division for all the wonderful work they've done with our students this year. And thank you again to everybody who has put so much work into the budget.
Thank you, Andrea, for your comments. And Craig, are you ready? You need to turn your mic on, please. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Finance Department for the work that they've done, especially since this is Avis's first time. Appreciate that. Appreciate the opportunity that we've had to discuss that a couple of times. I would echo a lot of the comments. I would also say that understanding that the government tries to be equitable, it does leave growing school boards at a disadvantage compared to, and I understand that because we don't want declining enrollments to suffer either, but I think the government could look at a little better way of doing that. I guess overall, it's a good budget. It's within our limited resources. My only 2 comments is that I think we need to have, I guess 3. One is that I think we need to give, especially the elementary schools, a little more site-based management. And that I think that we need to take some of the instructional money that's in central office and put it back and have those people back into the classroom. And not have as many people in central office, so changing some of the philosophy, I guess, and EAs. And I think that's the 3 main areas that I'm a little concerned about. But I would say that overall, between Christine and Avis, they've done a good job keeping us in line, and also realizing that the government has said that our surplus has to be 3.15% by next August. And so that means that there are programs that are maybe getting one-time funding that I guess my concern would be is that if they continue, where does that money come from? And so that would be a concern long-term, not this year, but later on. And so maybe there might be some discussion that's going to have to happen over the year as trustees and with the Finance Department that I hope we don't have to make a lot of tough decisions, but there might be because we do not know what the provincial government's going to do. So that's where I'm at. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. And Jenny?
I think that just leaves me. I'd add my gratitude to that has been expressed. I appreciate. I said to Avis when she gave us her first presentation, I said, thank you for making something understandable that is not typically understandable. And so I applaud the ability of both Christine and Avis to take things that are very complicated and explain them into a way where we still understand the details and the complex nature of it, but are able to comprehend what we are being shown and told. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate that as well as the color in your presentation. I do appreciate the graphs and the colors and the diagrams. It actually makes it easier to process and to remember. So I appreciate you both and the work on this budget. I also want to take time to acknowledge and appreciate the importance of this role for us as a board. And it's something that I've strived to understand this year is our stewardship and our obligation as a board to be stewards over the funding that comes through hard-earned money by our constituents. And I appreciate the effort that has been shown by the members of this board to try to be good stewards and to honor that responsibility. And so I appreciate the rest of you as well. Points of discussion. We've had a lot of discussion around our concern for the health and the mental health of our students and our teachers and those involved in our schools. And we have a concern for that. And we've tried to reflect that in our budget. And I think it's worth realizing and exploring options that are outside of our budget, that there are supports and additional services that we can access without taking from our budget, that we can continue to try to collaborate with and explore with institutions that are being funded outside of the school, like the PCN and things offered by through AHS, and to try to integrate where we can some of those services and support people into our schools and with our administrators, and that's one way that we can continue to achieve one of our goals without spending our own budget, to make our budget go as far as we can. Also, it's noted in our board priorities that one of the priorities we've recognized is a need for safe and consistent transportation for our students. And we have seen and heard the concerns around that this year as well as last. And so I recognize that as a board priority in this budget. And I would like to continue to recognize that as one of our priorities as we move into next year, that we need to be prioritizing transportation and looking for ways to improve where we can. And as we understand our reserves better, as we move forward into next year, I think we need to keep in mind that as a priority, as well as the need for classroom support in the form of EAs and reduced or maintained classroom sizes. And so that's been a priority that's been discussed extensively and at length, and I realize that we have a limited amount of money, and there is a reduction in our EA support, and with that in mind, I think that we need to recognize that also as a priority as we learn more about our available funding that may or may not be available to us as we move into next year. And with that in mind also, I think that it is worth considering some hard choices. And I recognize the value of each person in the position that they're filling. But if we're placed in a position where we have to make hard choices and we are considering either removing teachers or reallocating those who are paid out of our instructional budget who do not currently reside in a classroom, it would be my request that we look long and hard at that and consider making a reallocation to place people back in a classroom if we find ourselves in a position where we are reducing our teacher numbers and thus growing our classroom sizes. With that in mind also, the money that we have held back, the $320,000 that we've held back to give ourselves a buffer as we receive the rest of our registrations and as we get a better idea of our classroom sizes. My request would be if we can look now at who we have registered now and if we can already identify any hotspots, my position would be to dip into that to reduce the number of teachers that are not, well, I guess to hire in advance rather than playing catch up in the fall to try to make those classroom sizes workable. That covers my thoughts on that. So with that, thank you for all the input, and I've learned so much from each of you, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak.
Thank you. So I certainly echo a lot of the comments that my colleagues have made, and definitely in regards to the gratitude to our finance team, so Avis and Christine, and just recognizing as well that you're new this year and the amazing work that you have done for us, and then the amazing finance department that we have that continues to receive awards for the work that they do. So that's very much appreciated to know that we're at the top with what we're doing. So we appreciate that. With that, I'd also like to extend my thank you to the hard work that has gone into this from our instructional budget committee, the budget committee, looking at and trying to juggle, and as Christine said, like we're not given that much from the government, and we have to try to juggle around with what our board priorities are and try to balance out what is best. When we look at our class sizes, we look at priority of wellness, mental health, and just to see what they've come up with is phenomenal. To see the priority areas, when we have the funding in our early years and really looking at that as a priority in our division, as well as literacy, to be able to focus on that and to support our students. And we have that boost funding that is coming that will really look at the gaps that we've seen, and to really work on that is fabulous. As well, to see the work that we're putting into our students for their career planning and for that off-campus piece, as well as our Indigenous grad coaches, so that we can extend our graduation rates. So those are pieces that are definitely fabulous. The wellness supports and programs that we have are great to see in this budget, and being able to move forward with those pieces and support when we hear so much from our families and our staff, teachers, support staff, that the challenges that they're facing in the classrooms, and being able to support them with those wellness supports. In areas of growth, definitely, and I know that we have the contingency funding piece, and just looking forward for where we need to go, just the expansion in career planning and those pieces, to see what other students that we can support and ensure that we're supporting them, as well as class sizes. I don't think we could ever beat the drum enough that we need to keep those class sizes down. And then something that I don't think anybody would be shocked at, that I'd bring forward in regards to EA supports, and I'm not talking about an EA being tied to a student, but just the supports that we're providing to all students and the teachers in the classrooms, and the amazing work that the support staff do in ensuring that all of our students receive the education that they need is so important. So anytime I see in a budget that there's a reduction of EAs, that's definitely a concern for me, and that's one of the biggest concerns all along through this process that has been there for me, is that EA support piece. So for growth, for me, that would be my top priority as we move through the next year, as well as this budget process here today. And then, and I did chat with Christine and Avis that in regards to the process of receiving feedback. So we did receive some feedback to the division over the last week. And then Christine has let me know that next year we'll look at ensuring that we don't have to provide name and contact information, so that people can feel free to provide their feedback, because I did receive some feedback over the past week. So I appreciate all the feedback that has come in and the work that has gone on. So with that, that's the end of my comments. So thank you. So now we review our belief statements, and those are in your package. So for reviewing them, Christine, do we just...
Yeah, and the reason that we don't have to spend too much time on, we're just trying to draw your attention to the belief statements, because of course these are your kind of guiding principles other than your priorities when we develop the budget. It's just as we go through and you talk to each piece of the budget and approve each piece, it's just important to keep that in mind. And I don't know if, is there a need to review them? You've probably seen them 3 or 4 times now.
Yep. And a number of trustees have referred to them through their
Yeah.
conversations.
So, and
as
we
well,
also do
so
that for the public. So again, the public
they see
knows that
that.
there's some,
Okay.
it's grounded in some beliefs. Yeah.
Sounds good. So now I'll move on to revenues and allocations. Now, my understanding is I turn this over to Avis at this point. That sounds good.
And I just basically just have a just another comment just to recap from the board presentation. Total revenues for the division for the 22-23 school year are estimated to be 135.96 million. Within this funding, 91% is being received from the Alberta Education, and 2.54 million of one-time reserve funding will require ministerial approval. The information for this can be found on page 30 to 32 within the executive summary. And so there's no motion there yet, is there? And then just for to talk about the fees. So those would have been received in an email towards the end of last week. Each school submits a listing of every possible fee that could be charged at the school level for the school year 2022 to 2023. Once the listings have been submitted, they're compiled and the fees are updated within the SGF section of the budget reports. The fee schedule was attached to this agenda with that email last week. Did anybody have any questions on any of it? Yeah, certainly.
And just a quick comment. I mean, you will see on the fees, some fees are new because they're trying new options. Some of the schools, new experiences. You'll see some fees have stayed the same and some fees have gone up. As you can appreciate, in this last year, a lot of things have gone up. The cost of fuel, the cost of materials and goods. And so schools are, when they charge fees, they're not supposed to make a profit on their fees. It's meant to cover the costs. And so they're doing their best to estimate, particularly if they're planning a field trip that's, you know, next April, for instance. And so they may reduce, so the fee may come in a little less when they actually go to do the activity, but they're really trying to do what they can at this time to do their best at estimating.
I can make a motion, Alison.
Comments? Okay, go ahead, Christina.
So I would move that the board approve the 2022 and 2023 school fee schedule as presented.
Thank you, Christina. Is there any further comments on that? Seeing none, and can you switch it so I can see them? Sorry. Thank you. And those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you.
And Alison, I'm just going to interject here. Normally we would go to number B, overall revenues and allocations, which is page 30 to 32. Just in case there is a recommended adjustment to something we might do in the expenses, that will affect the revenues and allocations. So I think what we'll do is we're going to come to that last.
Okay. Sounds
Okay,
good.
if that's all right with everybody. And then we'll start on the actual expenditure pieces and then we'll come back.
Sounds good.
That might make more sense.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll move to expenditures and transfers. And so again, just to recap from the board presentation, the total expenditures for the division for the 2022-2023 school year will be 135.96 million. The funding is broken down into each of the following categories, so we'll go through them each individually. Instruction is estimated to be 111 million and can be found on pages 35 to 37 within the document. And then are we going to turn it over to Mike? Yeah, we'll turn it over.
I think there's a couple areas that we want to provide some further information and clarification on, particularly some of the concerns that we've heard and comments, just so that you have some more information when you're voting on the instructional budget. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike and then he'll give some information and then we have some other information.
Thanks, Christine. And just to share some context with the board, because you weren't here in March 2021 when we had our first board retreat. So I just wanted to share some of the information that I shared with the board at that time, or not our first board retreat, it was my first board retreat in Lethbridge School Division. So at that time, I had done some calculations, and I had estimated that when we looked at where our enrollment was and where our funding was because of the WMA, we were probably 40 to 50 teachers more than our enrollment and our funding warranted. And then in terms of support staff, we probably had about 30 support staff more than our enrollment and our funding warranted. Now that was because, of course, we had a big sudden drop in enrollment because of COVID, but also because of the weighted moving average coming in. So that's something we shared with the board. And I want to be clear on, it doesn't mean that that first year of COVID that people didn't work hard, that we had too many staff. Our staff worked incredibly hard. It's just that when you looked at our enrollment and the funding we had available, we just didn't have enough money and enough students to sustain our staffing levels long term. So obviously that was a concern, and the concern was that when the one-time COVID money went away, then that would create significant problems for us, particularly if we're making staffing decisions, long-term staffing decisions based on one-time money. So when we talked about it as executive council and board, I think we all felt that the enrollment was probably going to bounce back. And so we would use one-time money to kind of get through the dip that was created by COVID. And that's certainly what's happened. Definitely in grade 1 to 12, we think kindergarten numbers are coming back. Early learning, I think, is going to be a little bit of a challenge for us for a while in terms of numbers and predictable numbers there. But we certainly saw enrollment come back. So I think we made some wise decisions there. The challenge, of course, is ongoing in terms of funding. And we just have more one-time funding than certainly I've ever seen in my career and likely will ever see in my career. And again, a number of the trustees mentioned this, that the challenge is when we make long-term decisions using one-time funding, the balance is we want to spend the money, we want to keep the staff in place, but we also don't want to set ourselves up for 2-3 years down the road where we have to make these significant changes. So that's the needle we've always been trying to thread for the last couple years. And, I just wanted to say, with the amount of one-time money that's in the system right now, it's concerning when we're making staffing decisions for sure. But I want to say I appreciated the previous board and this board being willing to step up and say, you know what, we have to maintain staffing levels, and we will use one-time funding if we need to, and continue to advocate for better funding for schools and more appropriate funding. And, I think Avis mentioned something in the neighborhood of $2.54 million in reserves that we're looking at using this year. And a large portion of that is going to go towards staffing. So I just want to say a thank you for that perspective, and certainly heard loud and clear the desire to keep staffing in place in terms of teachers, educational assistants, and those folks in the classroom. So just wanted to give you that perspective, because I know this board wouldn't have been there for some of those conversations, but they certainly impact the situation that we're in now. And that's it for me.
And if you could bring up the document that I had sent you to, please, just so make sure that everybody on screen can see it. What we've done here is this is a summary of the inclusive learning funding for the 2022-2023 school year. So once everybody gets it, what this is it breaks it down into the different areas. So we've got inclusive learning. So we'll start at the top with the inclusive learning, where it says funding at the top, 21, 22, 22, 23, and the change. So you can see here that the grant funding, in fact, went up from 21-22 to 22-23. However, the reserve amount decreased by $100,000. So overall, the total funding in inclusive learning has decreased by about $27,000. Then if you look from there, then we can translate that over to the staffing portion. So it breaks it down between certificated and uncertificated staff. So the certificated remains the same, and the uncertificated changed by 0.17 of an FTE. So there isn't a huge change in that one. If anybody has any questions on that, we can move to the next. I'll move to the next one, if that makes everybody make sense. Perfect. So the next one is program unit funding, or PUF. So you can see the grant funding decreased from 21-22 by about $478,000. That was, we were able to use some COVID mitigation, but again, that is the one-time funding of $453,000 to kind of alleviate that enrollment. And then as well, reserves are being used for 22-23 of about $225,000. So when we translate that over to staffing for FTE, we can see that the certificated has remained the same, but the uncertificated has decreased by about 5.6 FTE. So that is a portion of that 11 FTE of the educational assistants that we discussed last week. And then it's a similar, does anybody have any questions there? No? Okay, so then it's a similar, when we go down to the severe kindergarten, similar with the enrollment drop, it decreased the funding to about $260,000 decrease, which then, if we look over at the staffing, is down about 5.85. And then with early learning, there's the grant funding COVID mitigation that remain the same. And then the early program fees are charged based on enrollment. So you pay $200 a month for your child to attend the early learning program fees, or the early learning program, sorry. So if we can see here that the overall, in all of these areas, the overall revenue decreased by about $640,000. But it is important to note that in 22-23, there's approximately $1.3 million of one-time funding within these programs between COVID and reserves. Does anybody have any questions on that piece? And yeah, certainly. Oh, okay, sorry. Because then I was just going to bring, if you look towards the bottom, you can see the enrollment from 2020 to 22-23. So you can see as well that the it did decrease, and it continues to do so. Yeah. Is there anything you would like to add, Christine?
No, and again, we've provided you this detailed information to give you context on the decrease in ease, because I know that's a concern, and we wanted to demonstrate that the decrease is because we're seeing such a reduction in the actual grant, and the grant is due to the number of students. And so it's not that students aren't being supported, there just isn't as many students at this time that are requiring those supports when we do the budget. So that's why we have that.
I hope that this provides a little bit more clarity in how that kind of came about last week.
Craig, go ahead.
So in September, if we have a significant increase in those numbers, we would be getting more grant money from the government? No, but we
only
would,
if it was over 5%.
over 5%.
And so I guess the other thing I just want to bring attention to within these numbers as well, there's already been contingent educational assistance accounted for. So within inclusive education, there's 6.5 FTE. Within PUF, there's 8 FTE. And within early learning, there's 3.7. So those have been already included within this budget. They will be, from my understanding from HR, they will be hired over the summer. So come the fall, they will be ready to go.
So if our numbers increase, we've got
the people in place. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
We do, I mean, and Mike can probably elaborate on this more, but we do always have the challenge, like we'll hire some now. We do sometimes get resignations over the summer. So sometimes even with our best efforts of hiring in advance, there's, some resignations, and those are sometimes hard to predict.
Any other questions on here? I just wanted to make sure that there was additional clarity, because I know there had been some questions last week. Yeah, certainly.
Tyler.
So I just want to make sure we're talking about bodies here. So when you're saying that the funding went down and it's funded per student, that means there's less bodies. But my question is, are there actual less kids, so we're not being funded, or are there less kids who meet the definition of PUF or whatever they require for funding?
So on the bottom here, PUF overall is at if you can see it is expected to increase for 22-23. Whereas I guess early learning, those are just your preschool, the non-complex children, those are currently decreasing. And that's likely to be kind of what Christina has also kind of alluded to, just the changing landscape of early education here in Alberta.
And I think it's also important to know, even though the puff on the 3-year, it dropped significantly in 21-22, we're projecting an increase for 22-23. Yeah, there'll be more kids, but we actually had more funding in that budget that we couldn't spend this year, and that's why we'll have carryover coming from that area to move over. So
okay, so good. So what we're really saying is that it's actually early education where there's going to, by the projection, there's going to be less kids there. It's not that they changed the way they do the PUF grant or anything else that way. So we're going to have less bodies in the classroom, which is what necessitates less adults to teach and supervise. Okay, thank you.
If there's, oh, sorry, Andrea.
Hi, and I just wanted to say that in the early education, if there is a classroom who just by configuration, not necessarily through PUF funding, needs support, we would have some money ready to go.
Yes, yeah. Like if there was an additional, there would be those EAs that are currently not allocated out.
Thank you.
Can I just add a comment really quick as well, Tyler, to your question? And I might be a little bit off on this, but my understanding over the past few years, there has been a bit of a tightening in terms of the qualifications to get PUF funding. So I think that probably is part of the story. I don't think it's exclusively the story right now, but I think your question is very perceptive and I think accurate as well.
Thank you. And then I see Christina. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm just ready for a motion if there's no more questions.
Cheryl.
And I just thought I would share sort of the insight of the Director of Inclusive Education as well in terms of the whole area of inclusion. And so, of course, you know, inclusion is a grant that covers a continuum of supports and services, and education assistants are one of those pieces of a continuum of supports and services. And, you know, in sort of conversation with Director of Inclusion, she talks about, you know, we have to remember that continuum of inclusion are those central education center located specialized services to students, our psychologists, speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, our physical therapists, our behavior support team, audiologists, teachers of the deaf and hearing and visually impaired, and so on. So all of those are part of the inclusion budget. And these professionals work directly with individuals, teachers, and school teams to help address diversity in the classrooms. And, you know, certainly one thing that's pointed out, if you were to gain insight from the director who directly oversees all of the schools and works with them directly, and what's communicated from schools and the Director of Inclusion, is that what she finds stretched thin the most would be the professional supports, especially her therapy team. And that she's got one occupational therapist across 24 schools and 6 SLPs who have caseloads that are approximately double that of an Alberta Health Services therapist. So, you know, just giving that lens that inclusion is a continuum of supports and services. And that certainly, although Anne's not in that position, actually we have a new person, in terms of where we're best meeting the needs of students. Sometimes, you know, it takes sort of that lens of what are the breadth of supports and services that are offered students, and what wisdom does that team of people have with respect to where really are the hot spots in terms of supporting kids in our schools.
Thank you, Cheryl. Craig.
and I don't know why I didn't catch this last week. Consultants in instruction is listed at 657,405.
Can you just identify the page that you're
Oh,
on?
page 36.
Okay, thank you.
Who would that include? Just and I'm sorry I didn't catch it last week, but
That could be a number of things because it's across all the schools. I think there's there are outside consultants we use, Cheryl, for inclusive learning. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the
So
details.
there would be more than inclusive learning for consultants, I
Yes.
believe. So our audiologists, of course, we belong to the Southwest, different than it used to be, the consortium current, shouldn't be asking the audience what that, the Southwest service delivery model. So we don't have our own audiologists, for example. We don't have our own specialized hearing impaired. And so those services are part of what we spend in that, through that consortium across Zone 6 to contribute to those specialists as well. Sometimes we have specialist services provided by different organizations such as KC. There's consultants that are brought in for behavior therapy. There's consultants that are brought in across a number of areas that work with school teams based on the needs of the students. So all of that funding for consultants used to fall under what was provincially funded under the health money. And then they moved that money, some of that, they didn't replace all of that, into school divisions and compelled school divisions. Some of that was where we hired our own speech language pathologists and OT, but some of those specialized services that used to fall under the umbrella of health services, we now contract out, some of that being with Alberta Health Services. And so I'm sorry, had I known the line in advance, I would have got a detailed accounting of that, but certainly that can be, we can look at a detailed accounting, but that would be most of it, although there's other consultants in other areas.
no, I was just wondering if they were outside people and they perform a specialized service that we don't provide. Okay, thank you.
Jenny, go ahead.
Can you also just clarify what falls under miscellaneous services? Sorry, same page 36, and it totals $287,000. Oh, sorry, this year it's reduced, 247.
Could be a variety of things.
Yeah.
I
Sorry.
was just going to say, I know with each individual school also has a miscellaneous that could be all sorts of, oh gosh, like luncheons or things like your catch-all obviously is your miscellaneous.
Cheryl?
Schools have a tendency to put money into miscellaneous more so than the division, right? And so because schools can't always accurately project 100% of time, if they do have a buffer of money under their site-based management model, and so if they have a little bit of money left over, they put it into miscellaneous so they can have some flexibility in terms of purchasing of resources or staff.
Craig?
Yeah, just co-curricular now, there's a decrease, but that's a school thing, isn't it? So are the schools predicting less co-curricular stuff?
Not necessarily. Sometimes they supplement. Like we give them a grant, and then they sometimes supplement it in other areas. And so when you see a decrease, they're not necessarily supplementing it.
And is some of that funded by student fees? The co-curricular? No. So it's either allocated by a grant from us and then they supplement it with money that they have in their reserves or whatever.
Yes.
Okay.
Andrea, go ahead.
I'm wondering in the fall, if we need our student enrollment, if we could use the contingency money of the $338,000 to ensure that every kindergarten has a teacher and an EA in it, if they don't have a PUF EA already, to ensure the safety of the kindergarten children, because 5-year-olds really do need someone at the front of the line and the back of the line.
I think what Andrea is requesting is, we have held back revenue in this budget of around 320, I think it's around 320,000, just in case we don't make our enrollment. We've done that last couple years, and it's kind of saved our bacon, because if we don't make our enrollment, it gets clawed back. And so we've lowered it by, it was 1.2 million this year, and we were held harmless in this budget year, which was nice. When we didn't make our enrollment projections. And so if we make our enrollment projections, that money is available to be used for a variety of things that we determine our priorities. It could be for addressing class size, because if we get, for instance, increased enrollment, we could add teachers. It could be to address if we had a number of student needs come in. It could be allocated to student needs. So there's a variety of places it could be allocated to. Certainly, if the board said these are the priorities we want you to look at in the fall, should we have that money available and not have to that it's going to be clawed back, then these are good priorities to use it for. That would be a good way to talk about it. You've mentioned one priority. Maybe there's other priorities.
Tyler and then Jenny.
Just as far as Andrea's comment, I wouldn't want to handcuff the division into saying that if we meet enrollment projections, this money is going to kindergarten, because there may be other places where it's deemed to be more needed and more appropriate, whether that be we have a massive class size in grade 2 and we need to allocate resources there to get that done. So I'm okay with the board saying if we meet that and this money's available, that for us kindergarten would be a priority. But I don't want us to say that we are allocating, that if we get there, we are allocating this to kindergarten. So that I'm not comfortable with, just based on how many different variables and different needs there may be for the funds, especially if we have full enrollment and or higher enrollment that we're not funded for.
And Jenny?
My comment echoes that. I recognize the value of your suggestion, Andrea, and the need in kindergarten classrooms, especially for bathroom breaks and things like that. It's difficult to leave a kindergarten classroom without another adult in it. But I also recognize Tyler's point, and classroom size is certainly a priority, and we've heard that in our town hall feedback as well. And so I would be interested to know, where is our threshold for tolerance right now in determining whether a classroom size is appropriate or not, in deciding whether we're holding on to and keeping in reserve that full 338,000, or if we're going to say now, let's use some of it. And so I would be interested to know, where are we saying a classroom is too big and needs another teacher? Where is our threshold in that? Or an 8, either way.
Cheryl?
Maybe there's two parts that I'm not understanding. So at what point do we know that we would have access to the 300 if we meet our projected enrollment?
Our count is September 30th, but
we know early, right? So with respect to access to that money, if we meet our enrollment and where that gets targeted, it's been my experience that there's two pieces to consideration. So there's not, just like there's not a magic number for what's the best class size, there's not a magic number for what's the class size for splitting a class, for example, into 2 different classes, or for providing an assistant in a classroom, because it really has a lot to do, size and complexity work together. And so, for example, there can be some classes and principals, of course, know their schools deeply, and work with our associate superintendent, human resources, as well as our director of inclusion, to make sure that good decisions are made about where resources are allocated, because it has a lot to do with complexity. And so a principal may say, really, I know this class size is 28, but really I need assistance. I need an assistant in this class for this reasons because of the complex needs in this class, or I would rather have this class divided than that class. And those kinds of decisions are based on complexity and size. At kindergarten, again, there's not necessarily a magic number. When we had, I can't recall a time when we haven't addressed a class not having an assistant. I know that this year there was one class. I visited that class within the first week of school, spoke to the teacher. We brought in an substitute aide until such a time as we could hire someone to put into the classroom. And so certainly, I mean, and unless I'm not aware of where there was a classroom, a kindergarten class without an assistant, it doesn't always happen that there's a puff student. Now, it may be if a class has, less than 15 kindergarten students that the individuals overseeing kindergarten, so Director of Inclusion, Instructional Services, and Human Resources might have a conversation with that school in terms of what are the structures to ensure the classroom is safe and that there's protocols in place for that. But so long answer to a short question, there really isn't a number. There's a number of complex factors looked at, and HR, inclusion, instructional services works with the principals.
Thank you. Andrea?
Thank you for that. And I appreciate that principals are able to advocate for the safety of their students. And I know there were 2 classes who did remain without EA support this year. And I just wanted to speak to the safety of the young children. And if we could start maybe a list of priorities, that would be great too. Thank you.
Jenny?
Sorry, would you mind just speaking briefly to the history of the use of this? I know that you've mentioned that this is a practice that we've done on a yearly basis to withhold that money, and I recognize the wisdom in that. Can you just speak to the history of how that money usage has been needed year to year?
Absolutely. And that is an amazing question, Jenny, because we've only been doing this for 2 years, and we're entering the 3rd year of the new funding framework. So before the funding framework came in, on September 30th, that would be our count date, and we get funded for what we call bums in seats. So when we did budget, we would project the enrollment, and usually when we're being conservative, when we didn't hold back revenue, we're just conservative in maybe how we spent the money. And then when we saw bums in seats, then we could, put the money in. Now with the new funding model, we project our enrollment to them in December. So that's quite a ways, like that's almost, 10 months ahead of when we actually see kids arrive. We project our enrollment. They use the weighted moving average, and we want to project in many cases, a little higher, so that we don't want to be short, because we're short, we don't get the money unless now they've added this 5%. 5% is like 400 kids for us. It's a big target to hit that 5%. So we try and do our best to project so we're not too high, but we also don't want to be too low. So when we did the first year under the new model, COVID hit, and we were, I think we're like $3 million under on our projections. So in the new model, they'll give you the money. So we would have had that to use for the year. And then we didn't meet our projections. We wisely held it back, knowing we didn't get our kids. So we did hold it back. But under the new model, when you don't meet, they'll keep the money for the year, but in the next year, they pull that funding back. So you're actually robbing from the kids of the next year in order to pay that back, which is, so when boards hits year 2, which was this current year we're in, year 2 are like, oh goodness gracious, now what are we doing, right? And then they gave us the COVID mitigation funding. And so that was very helpful. delayed the inevitable, and then they've done now the same. So then when we did budget this time last year, there was about 1.2 million closely that we're thinking, okay, we may not make that enrollment because we're still unsure. There was no stability in the model because enrollment was hard to project, COVID and all that stuff. And so we held that money back because, again, knowing that they could claw it back, and we thought that would happen. So when they did the hold harmless again for 22, 23, we now had that money to use. And so we've put that into the budget. That's one-time money we're using. So then when we did the budget this time, we got a little shaved a little closer to the line with our projections, and only figured about 300,000. So we're taking a small risk. But I think, we've been looking at things, and what Mike's been hearing for schools, that we might come up on that number, where we might have it available. But again, over the summer, families move in, move out. Sometimes they're, we don't know, like kindergarten, they'll register in one school and register in another. And we don't know about that when it's kindergarten because they're not in the system yet. So, so there's a lot of things that happen. And so we've gotten a little closer with our projection, and I'm hoping that we get to keep that money at the end of the year and that we've met that and exceeded a little bit. We don't want to exceed it too much because, again, that's kids not being funded, though we'll get funded the year after. So it's a double-edged sword. It really is. Yeah.
Craig.
Yeah, just so I'm clear on that. So in other words, the money in, let's say, 2021, we didn't spend all of the money we could have spent because you held it back, right?
Back because thought we were clawed back, so then we got to use it in the next school year.
So if you hold it back and then we meet our projections, they don't claw it back, then it can be moved forward, right?
It can be moved. Well, we got to be careful about moving forward. So what we do is we defer it.
Yeah.
We defer it, but if they're not clawing it back, that means there is no clawback. It means we have to spend it in next year. And with the cap,
right,
we can. Before we could have just said, yeah, we'll just throw it in for reserves because we know we're using lots of one-time money. We'll have that to use the next year. But because of the cap, we can't carry reserves to help us with our short term.
Okay, so in the accounting world, how does that? If the government looked at our forms, it's not in reserves. Where do we put it?
It's in deferred revenue on the balance sheet.
Deferred revenue, and the government allows us to do
Yes.
that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. From the audited, like if you were to go look at the 2020, 2021 audited statements, it would be on the liability section of the balance sheet. And then the next year it's recognized in revenue.
Okay.
You betcha.
Thanks.
Make that 300,000 that we're saying we're going to defer right now. If come September we've got the kids, it's not deferred anymore. It doesn't go deferred, it goes straight into our revenue, and we need to spend it because of our reserve cap.
Not seeing any more questions or comments. Christina.
Yes. So I move that the board approve the instruction expenditures and transfers as per pages 35 to 37 of the 2022-2023 budget as presented.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you.
So the next one we'll move to administration. So administration revenue and expenses for the 22-23 school year are estimated to be $4.1 million. And these can be found on pages 38 to 40 of the executive summary.
Thank you, Avis. Questions or comments? Craig.
Just this would be more for the public that's listening. What is our cap according to the government?
Our the administration is funded at 3.15% of the budget, but it hasn't changed for the 3 years, so it's actually slightly less than the 3.15. Our expenditures are just over 3.01.
3.01.
So it has actually, because of the growth in the last 3 years, it's no longer 3.15. It's
So if there are things that come up that we need to spend, we do have room under the cap, right?
no, we have to spend according to it's not the cap. it's the money they give us. So we have to spend within the $4 million plus the amortization we can use within that funding, or we can use reserves, but we can spend more if we have reserves to use.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Seeing no other questions or comments, Christina?
I move that the board approve the administration expenditures and transfers as per pages 38 to 40 of the 2022 to 2023 budget as presented.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? Is that a question? Pardon? You're ready? Okay. Those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you.
All right, next we'll move to plant operations and maintenance. So revenues and expenses for plant operations and maintenance are estimated to be 10.3 million for the 2022-2023 school year. Those can be found on pages 41 to 43.
Thank you. Questions or comments for Avis? Craig?
And under plant operations and maintenance, there's no cap from the government. Is that correct? Or is there?
No, there's no cap. No. We get our grant. This includes the O&M grant and the IMR grant. But yeah, there's no cap.
And that's based on enrollment, correct?
Yes, there's enrollment and also facility space based on there's rates based on utilization. So
okay,
yeah.
Tyler?
Could I just have Christine or Avis just quickly recap what the PO&M and IMR changes were from the prior year? Just like almost like percentage wise, we got the same as we got last year, or we got, $400,000 less or whatever. Just because I know there's some changes to the different
There was, yes,
ones that went in.
yes, absolutely. So the plant operations and maintenance base grant went up by 1%. However, with the COVID mitigation funding, we clawed back some in 21-22, so that's being now reflected in 22-23. That's why you can see that there is a decrease, as well as there's the use of reserves again for 22-23 of about $200,000 to help with cost pressures.
And IMR, I think, went up like $25,000. CMR, which is actually capital maintenance renewal, is not reflected in here because it's considered capital, because everything is capitalized, so it doesn't go through the operating budget. It was reduced by about $600,000.
Thank you. I just think that's important for any other public to know that those things are coming and going. But
Christina, is that a question?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if you could provide a bit of context. I know that we're doing a lot of upgrades and looking at different upgrades to schools, as well as preparing for the new school, which I imagine is under capital. But can you remind me if there's any impact to this section based on those upgrades and things?
Well, the upgrades we're doing, so we'll talk about the biggest upgrade that you've just approved, which is next door here at Victoria Park. Victoria Park is going to be funded from a couple places. So it's funded mainly from capital maintenance and renewal grant, that $1 million, and it was approved by the government. We give them a list of 5 priorities, of which Victoria Park was number 1. And they gave us I think we asked for like 18 million and I got $1 million. So anyways, so $1 million for that. And then we'll use a little bit of what we call IMR. We'll go to this project as well to help it along, because it's we can pull back some stuff that we're doing. I think it's about 1.6 a year that we wanted to do over there. We'll pull back a little bit on that, but we will use a little bit of IMR. And then IMR, infrastructure maintenance rules, there's about a large list of school projects that we do, from concrete work to flooring to bathrooms and that sort of things. And we go through and we do a lot of that in the summer. And that IMR is part of the expenditures in here. We also have money that we carry over year to year, because sometimes in the past we didn't spend all that money, and so it carries over, and then we deal with priorities as we go. And that's why we sometimes have money to help with bigger projects with the IMR. So that's in here. With the new school build, we haven't seen any of that money because it's completely run by Alberta Infrastructure, and they will they stick handle that whole process. They're just getting ready to go out, I believe, for tender on the 5 schools, of which ours is in there, and see if a proponent will take it on. And so that's going to start here, I think, late June. But we don't. That's not in here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you bet.
Okay.
Jenny?
Again, on the miscellaneous, sorry, the $700,000 price tag on a budget of only 10 million is significant. So can you just speak to what that would entail on page 42? Seems like a large percentage of the budget.
It's in there. We have we pay for amenities with the city of Lethbridge for our joint use. So we have a joint use agreement of which we, I think that's that line. Yeah, it's a joint use agreement. So we have, so through the city of Lethbridge joint use agreement, we pay them to look after all the grounds, school grounds. So they look after the school grounds, they inspect our playgrounds, that sort of thing. And so that's our share. Holy Spirit has a share, we have a share, that sort of thing. That's through the joint use. It also includes money that we pay to the 3 Christian schools for their share of plant operations and maintenance grant. So they get a portion of that. There's a per student portion of our plant operations and maintenance grant, and a portion that goes to the Christian schools for maintaining their facilities. Because we get a per student. They're not our facilities. They own their facilities, but part of our agreement with them is money we get on a per student. They get that. So that's in that. Yeah.
Then, sorry, what then is ground maintenance? The line ground maintenance, if ground maintenance is covered under miscellaneous?
That's around your
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just, and I found this out a few years ago. When we build a new school, the city of Lethbridge gives us money sometimes to build a bigger gym, right? And they get to control the gym after a certain hour, is that right? And do they get the revenue from that?
Part of the joint use agreement is, yes, the city of Lethbridge pays to upsize a few of our schools. When somebody rents the facility, they get, the city collects it for us, but they pays for our caretaking if they're after hours.
Right.
And then the money also goes into a pot that we eventually get back.
And in return, other than Henderson, we get free access to the skating rinks and swimming pools?
Yes, during school hours and the picnic shelters.
And the picnic shelters, which I think is important for the public.
Yes, we actually get a really good benefit. And then the really big benefit is the city handles all the bookings. So
That's
it's
right.
fantastic. It's actually a great relationship.
Okay, thank you.
Jenny?
I'm sorry, this is slightly off topic, but it's on topic with Craig's comment. I did have just the other day a parent ask me, they had approached a school wanting to rent the gyms and had been told that they were not allowed to and that it was a policy coming out of our division office, and that didn't sound accurate to me. And so I appreciate that conversation, and I meant to ask for clarification on that. And so I'm asking now for clarification on that. If somebody wants to rent the gyms, they speak to the city.
They have to go through the city for after use because of the fact there's such a long use of people wanting to use our facilities that they have to go through the city to book it. And the schools, by the way, schools get first priority. So if a school is holding, I'll give an example for Plaxton was holding their spring event. They would tell the city, by the way, we're holding our spring event, our gym that night. They get first priority. And so then what they would do, if they know it in advance, it helps the city to make sure they're not booking it, or they will do a reorg for the groups.
And do our administrators have the ability to give a blanket, no, we don't rent ours out, or?
They have to have a very good reason why they're not renting it out, as in they have to have use going on in their schools.
Okay.
Yeah, because of the
so,
fact we get the reciprocal of using the city facilities.
And what is after hour? What is the hour that
It's
becomes?
5:30, I think it's 5:30,
Okay.
5:30 to 10.
I could add to that a bit because, of course, it looks different at elementary level, middle school, high school, and so availability of elementary. That's one of the reasons the city is, very gracious in upsizing our elementary schools because those gymnasiums are typically available in the evening, except for special events, and schools can always take priority. Middle schools, the gyms start to get a little busier with the athletics that are going on, and high schools. Typically, those gyms are booked all the way well into the evening during your volleyball, your basketball, Badminton, not quite, but certainly during volleyball and basketball seasons. So right from the beginning of school through to the end of March, those schools, there would be very little availability for community use in the evening because of practices. Probably some use maybe on weekends, but I don't know if what weekends look like. But so it does vary by level availability, right?
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions or comments. So Christina,
I move that the board approve the plant operations and maintenance expenditures and transfers as per pages 41 to 43 of the 2022-2023 budget as presented.
thank you. Any further comments or questions? Go ahead, Jenny.
For the future, I would feel more comfortable approving something if I had a better understanding when a price tag takes such a significant part of a budget under miscellaneous, to have the ability to see what that is. I would feel I'm doing my responsibility with more diligence if I know what it is that I'm approving.
Thank you for that comment. Any further? Seeing none, those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you.
All right, next we'll move to transportation. So transportation is estimated to be 3.1 million for the 22-23 budget and can be found on pages 44 and 45 of the executive summary.
Thanks, Avis. Any questions or comments for Avis? Craig.
Well, I would just like to make the comment. I know that it's been difficult the last 2 years. I think that's the lot. We've had to have buses that weren't supplied by the city 1 year. And so we're into our second year. And you did mention, and it wouldn't hurt to mention again, we've got what you would consider a favorable contract with Southland.
Yes, we've got a modest increase over the 5 years of the contract. Anybody renewing right now a busing agreement from the boards I've talked to, they're experiencing increases of 10 to 15%, and we're considerably under that in our 5-year deal. So we are it's a good deal. The problem we face right now with our with the transportation funding is transportation funding when they moved to the new model. What they did is they said, here's your funding now, and we're going to just give you. They gave us a 5% increase in that first year, and then no increase this year, and then they're giving us 4.66 for next year, which is great. In that meantime, they're supposed to put in a new funding model for school divisions. Because we didn't have the opportunity to put in numbers of ridership, because that's how we used to be funded, we experienced large growth in ridership naturally because we're busing kids from West Lethbridge, right? And so we're having to cover those costs within our grants. Had we been able to put in a grant submission, we would have had way more money, and it could have probably added even more buses, which would have been help our situation out. Certainly help our situation out. So anyway, so I'm hoping the new funding model that comes out for next year sees it's fair and reasonable and hopefully recognizes ridership because we have a significant increase in qualifying students, and which we would have had more funding for if they had not frozen the funding.
Okay, and
the contract itself, how long is it? 5 years?
It's 5 years, yes.
And is there any place where they can invoke a clause to increase it, or we can? I mean, just
I mean, there's certainly clauses in there where they can come to the table and have a discussion with us.
okay.
Yeah.
And so if the government comes through with a a lot better funding model for transportation, and it's significant, then we would look as a division at not this year, but in future of being able to add more buses if it's a sustainable amount of money that the government's going to give us.
Yes, if it fits within our model. Right now, one of our challenges, not necessarily the contract price, but it's fuel right now, because there isn't a fuel escalator, so that they don't make a profit on fuel. But as fuel goes up, our price goes up, right? And so as long as fuel stays high, that's going to be a problem, because we're having to use reserves for that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, Andrea, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I agree with Craig about that, about in the future, hopefully being able to add buses to make the ending times of the days for all the schools more equitable.
Thank you. Seeing no, Tyler.
I just want to make a comment too in regard to that. While I agree with both of what they said, we do have to remember that there's also been a bus driver shortage due to what goes on. So even if we said tomorrow, hey, we can add 30 buses to our route and make the world a lovely place, we can't find 30 drivers. So I think there is a balance there, and hopefully, like Craig says, in a couple of years, I think hopefully that will work itself out over time, and we will be able to get more bus drivers. But it's not that simple of a solution as far as bus driving goes right now, unfortunately. It is very difficult to hire bus drivers for the times that you need them.
Yeah, and you make a very valid point. It's still an issue. They're continually hiring, and they'll hire 3, and then 1 or 2 will leave to get, a full-time job, right? And with the economy, people are looking more to full-time jobs. When the economy's good, sometimes they don't need with inflation, if it's not inflation, then they can work a part-time job, because bus driving is a part-time job.
Jenny.
What is bus pass purchases? What is that?
We purchase a City of Lethbridge Breeze passes for students that are 2.4 kilometers from Winston Churchill. And also we provide Breeze passes for Victoria Park students. Yes. And that's how we always have operated, and so we've continued to operate that. Yeah. Consultants is that 45 is our, oh sure, I'm trying to remember. That is hang on, there's a number for, that's the Berger demographics program. That's the demographics program we use for planning. And we use it for also helping with our routing. Yeah.
Programs like that are expensive, yes. Yeah. Okay, no further questions or comments? Christina.
I move that the board approve the transportation expenditures and transfers as per pages 44 to 45 of the 2022-2023 budget as presented.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? Seeing none, those in favor? That's carried. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. So last but not least is the capital and debt services for 7.3 million for the 2022-2023 school year, which can be found on pages 46 to 47 of the executive summary.
And are there questions or comments on this one? Craig.
So I always get confused with amortization. That's not really, it's an expense, but we're not putting money out, are we?
It is it's a non-cash item. So yeah, so it's not physical cash moving, it's a accounting. So you buy an asset for $1 million and then you're going to amortize it over the next 10 years and recognize a portion, 100,000 of it over the next 10 years.
Yeah, so it's like wear and tear, and you know that the
Yeah.
building's gonna,
It's the useful life of the,
yeah,
yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
okay.
Yeah.
Seeing no other comments or questions, Christina?
I move that the board approve the capital and debt services expenditures and transfers as per pages 46 and 47 of the 2022-2023 budget as presented.
Thank you. And no further questions or comments. Those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you.
We're going to move back up now. So you've just had all the expenditures, right, by block. Now we're going to move back to the overall revenues because you didn't make any changes in the expenditures. So before we do overall budget approval, we're going to go back and look at the revenues.
I have already I guess I've already made my comments about the revenues. I guess, were there any additional questions within pages 30 to 32 of the executive summary?
Craig, go ahead.
Just so that, because of the weighted moving average, first of all, what is the per pupil funding that the province gives us? Per student?
Well, it depends kind of on the grade, but
Yeah.
if it's, the details are here on page 30. So if you're kindergarten, we
Okay.
get
Oh, there it is.
3,062, grades 1 to 9, 6125. 10 to 12 is, there, you don't see the base rate, but it's broken out between 1 to 3 years.
All right.
And then 4 and 5, you get a little less for each year there.
And that's taking into effect the weighted moving average? So if the government ever changed that, there'd be an increase because it would be per year then, right? If the government moved away from the weighted moving average, then it would have to be X amount of dollars per child per year.
Yes, yes. And yeah, the rate would probably look a little different, I would imagine.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Seeing none, go ahead, Christina.
I move that the board approve the revenues and use of one-time reserves for the 2022-2023 budget as per pages 30 to 32 as presented.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? Seeing none, those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you.
All right, well, those are the main sections. So now we're just going to go to the last one where we're going to approve the overall budget. I guess I don't have any additional comments if anybody else does.
Craig?
Yeah, just if there's some additional expenses that come up, it would have to be approved by the board.
It depends on the expense, right? Like if
Okay.
it's we're operating within a budget which is flexible. So if it was something extremely outside the range, then you would need to approve
Okay.
it. Yeah.
But this, I guess what I would say is that this is a living, breathing document and can be adjusted. Just like we said, if the first 2 weeks of September we have more students, then that's the flexibility built into it, right?
That's correct.
And then there's also the September 30th budget update. So if once, all the pieces kind of have settled, then that's prepared and approved in November.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just, there's only one date now that we have to worry about, right? There used to be the September 30th and January 30th dates, which were always confusing, but anyway.
Yeah, and technically under this model, we're not supposed to worry about September 30th, but we do, right?
Yeah.
Because we worry for the next year of pulling back money if we don't make our enrollment, or if our enrollment grows more than 5%. They haven't put in details yet in the funding model how they're going to address the 5%. Is it 5% on your regular enrollment and they'll look at an increase, or is it 5% on, for instance, let's assume our kindergarten KG, severe KG kids went up more than 5% than we projected. Would they adjust our grant funding in that pocket? So I haven't seen the details on how that'll work. That would be nice if they did it by pocket, because those are smaller pockets and could easily have a 5% increase if that happened, right? Versus our overall enrollment. So we'll keep an eye on that for sure.
Any other comments or questions?
Well, I'm just looking forward into the fall. We have to remember too, we've got some unknowns yet, right? That will be coming and put into the fall budget. So we still have the allocation of dollars for resources for implementation of the new curriculum. We still have unknown amount of dollars coming for what the province has called wellness and learning gap funding. And we still have funds coming for professional learning support for teachers for the implementation of the new curriculum. So those will be hopefully some larger items in the September budget.
Tyler.
On top of that, we also have some unknowns as far as employee negotiations and wages going forward. So that's going to be really interesting to see what gets funded, what doesn't get funded, because ultimately I think some things won't. But before we wrap this all up, because I think when you're done, we're done. Relating back to Andrea's comment at the very start in regard to kindergarten EAs, I would like to see, we can discuss this as a board, but I know Andrea's on board. I would like to see us, and maybe it's Christina, or we're already here, but if we take that back to budget committee to say that, hey, when everything shakes out in September and we know where everything goes and we know what we have available in contingency, because there was, in this budget, there is very good planning in regard to contingency for hotspots and different things that happen. But when it all shakes out, I think it would be good that we had that to say that, look, and for me, I would like to really expand that a little bit, even from kindergarten to like Div 1, but K to 3 kind of thing. That I guess I should make this comment first, that I do believe that our administrators and our team and everybody always has child safety at the forefront of everything going on. And I do believe there's a plan there and everything else. But what I would say is tell them that, hey, Andrea's going to be looking because I promise you she is. She's going to be looking at kindergarten and see who's got an assistant and who's got puff in their class and who doesn't. So I just think it would be prudent for us to say, hey, that's kind of a priority, that we want to make sure that nothing's overlooked there, and if there is a class that doesn't have an EA in it, that may not fly with Andrea, it might with me, as long as, there's a good explanation of this is why we looked at it and this is the reason for that, and we felt it better to be a grade 1, or we felt whatever the case may be. But I think maybe if we just have some type of thing going back to budget committee in regard to the priority on our contingencies in September, if everyone might agree with that or not, or if there's anyone has comments on that.
Jenny and then Craig.
Yeah.
I don't know how I slipped in ahead of you. Mine was like a wavering hand raise. So thanks. My experience in this first year of being involved in this has been very informative, and I'm still trying to fully understand the process. But as far as I understood, I sat on the board committee. What is it actually called? Board budget committee, which was atypical this year, correct? We met as an entire board instead of as that committee. And then there is also an administrative budget committee, correct? Is there an instructional budget committee? Is there any other budget committees? Okay, so then my question is, would it be beneficial for those two committees to meet and to plan budget together and to hear each other's perspectives? There's a head shaking there. Help me understand this.
She wants to know why you were shaking your head.
I don't see the need for those two to get together or what it would really accomplish. I think instructional budget committee, they're starting at a different point than where the board budget committee is. They're more in the day-to-day of everything that's going on and how they're allocating and doing that. And they bring in the bigger picture back to the board and saying, this is how we've allocated our money for the school. We're pretty comfortable with this. We're comfortable get, or no, I think we're short based on this, based on enrollment. We're going to be short 2 teachers here. You need to find some things. Now, that being said, I don't know a lot about it because I don't sit on an instructional budget committee, but that would be my take as an outsider on that.
Craig?
Yeah, I would support Tyler's thought on that EAs. I do believe that when I look at it, it would be a priority to have kindergarten. However, as I think Tyler mentioned, that even though we have it as a priority, we could just say we trust our principals to make the best decision for children, and thus they know what our priorities are. But if they feel like if they have a small kindergarten class, but a large grade 1 or grade 2 class that they need extra support in, I would support, obviously, them making the choice other than being told, other than letting our administrators know that this is a concern from the board that we recognize, but it's up to them how they want to fund it. But I would agree with Tyler on that, is that we do need to make sure that that's one of our priorities going forward.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Andrea?
I just wanted to say thank you, Tyler, for that support, and to everybody. Thank you. That really means a lot.
Go ahead, Jenny.
So moving into the fall, when we receive back some of the missing pieces right now, when we know our enrollment numbers, when we know some of those allocations that we're still anticipating and having increased optimism for, and when we know some of the settlements coming out of different involvement with different staffing things, as those pieces are coming in, what does board involvement in processing that and in just making decisions, what does that look like as far as the board being involved in participating in those decisions?
Well, generally, we try and take the guidance that we've taken here and allocate changes based on that. So we look at priorities. Certainly, we can come back with recommendations of what we see based on the funding before it's done. That's always a possibility. Yep.
Tyler?
If it's really on its significance, right? If it was a huge significance, then we usually do. If not, we make an administrative decision.
I would say historically it's been kind of, it's more information because, like Christine said, this is where we've kind of given guidance on that. And generally Mike would come and say, look, we had a problem at Winston Churchill. We ended up with grade 10 having, class size we expected to. There was just too many. The classes were too big. We had to make 3, so we had to put a teacher in there. That's where one allocation went. And then when it would come, if it went something beyond that, where we've already put in contingency to be able to move it around and for them to have the flexibility to staff, if it came in and said, look, we just, we were out on what we thought here, and we set aside 4 teachers, but we need 6. It's just where we're at. Then that kind of thing might come here, and then we have a discussion about something like that. But I think if it's within their contingencies and how they're planning, we kind of just get an update of what happened, right?
Craig?
Yeah, and just as far, like, we know that the board doesn't really have any control over the TIBA contract, but we also have to vote on other contracts. And that would have, depending on what the government does or what doesn't, that would have a significant impact on our budget. So that would have, that's got to be discussed at the board level, right? And it's got to be approved by the board. So that, but the other stuff is you've had the priorities, you tell the principals, they have the flexibility to decide how to run their school. And that just needs to, like, all we'd be told is you've hired more teachers or more aides, and this is where they've gone. So thanks.
Jenny?
I'm trying to understand this process as well as I can, beginning to end. And so tell me if this is not the right venue to ask this question, but I just have a curiosity. When we allocate money to our schools, and what level of autonomy do those schools have on, like, within in-house to decide how they then set up their own budget? Is that done in collaboration with the division? Do they have a fair amount of autonomy to decide this goes to here? Is it governed by law? How does that work when we say, okay, here's your funding for the year? How does that process then look like?
So we have a strong belief in site-based management, but given that, we do have a consultation process, particularly when it comes to staffing, for teacher staffing and educational assistants and whatnot, so that making sure that we're working together to put them in the best places. So for instance, with elementary's given a pot of money. We have a formula for how we allocate money to them for instance, secretarial, for supplies, that sort of thing. They'll determine their supplies, like that's total autonomy. When it comes to teachers, they work with Mike, because Mike takes a look at the amount of money we have to work with in the elementary pool, and then he deals with the needs and looking at their class sizes and configurations and that sort of thing. And so, I mean, Mike can tell you a little bit more about that, but that's the high level. With the middle schools and the high schools, they're given their funds, and then they determine, working with Mike, they'll determine the level of staffing they need. Working with Rhonda, they'll determine their secretarial support, their learning commons support, and that sort of thing in consultation on that piece. And then they have, again, full autonomy on their expenditures. The supply side, we call it.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, and I'm not sure Craig's coming back or just wait. Perfect. Okay, so Christina.
So I move that the board approve the 2022-2023 preliminary budget for Lethbridge School Division as detailed in the previous motions, and authorize administration to allocate and expend funds in accordance with the budget, and that the board authorize administration to amend the 2022-2023 preliminary budget if required by changes in the requested ministerial approval on use of reserves.
Thank you. Further questions or comments? Seeing none, those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you, and thank you very much for all the hard work that went into this and all the questions that were asked and answered very well, and going through all the detail with us to help everybody understand. So we appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. Perfect. Sounds good. So Tyler is anxious to make sure that adjournment is there, and those in favor of adjourning, and that is carried.